Howdy, all you delicious people. You know what? You go into a Google search and you end up finding out about a movie. Isn't that great? No, that was a joke. Or was it? So, going into this movie, I really thoroughly enjoy it. Good God, do I really just am so amped every single time I see this movie. Because me, I never really liked Superman. Like, to me, I really could give or take Man of Steel. It has an interesting story, but there's also a lot of stuff that you kind of just go, yeah, like a real commercial like movie. Like trying to desperately like figure out the funds of destroying all these things within this town with sponsorship and all kinds of things. Like this movie was trying to very much be like, how can we desperately cling on to so many places to try to get money from them to make this film, and how goofy was that? The original Superman franchise, I would say that those movies, albeit kind of slow, they're just kind of fun films. Eventually, at some point, and this will kind of date when this review probably will come out, eventually, I want to eventually at least review Superman 2. I know I would also like to eventually review Quest for Peace, Superman 4, just because I actually like Quest for Peace, and a lot of people may not. Going into this movie, I would say probably my favorite Superman story is actually Injustice God Among Us. The very beginning of that story, where we just have Superman who had lost things, and I guess I shouldn't spoil the story just in case anybody is going to go and read it for the first time after me talking about it. Injustice God Among Us is a story about Superman who had basically lost everything. So he ends up taking the entire world hostage to just say, you know what? We're going to create world peace and we're going to do it right now. Like, everybody drop what they're doing and create world peace right here and now. And I am going to basically, like, halter every bit of progress until that happens. And so really, that is probably hands down to me the best Superman story, the story that I can probably enjoy the most. Even though there is also other Superman like things out there, even the brand new Superman and Lois show, which actually I can mostly enjoy. Going on into Brightburn, I kind of like the fact that we end up having a kid called Brandon Breyer who is to start twisting and turning and doing all of these really and truly horrific things. And plus, we end up realizing that, oh my god, we already know the concept of this film. We already know that this kid is going to be this unstoppable like force. And now we're just kind of waiting for the pin to drop for this kid to eventually, further and further along into this film, go on to just have to just really just rip and tear people apart. Sadly enough. But a lot of people could have different sides of the sword within this movie. Some people might be rooting for Brandon in this entire film. Some people might have tried to root for the humans in this film. Some people might have hoped that they would have come up with some weakness for Brandon at some point within this film, and so on and so forth. Going into this movie, I like the fact that this movie is so dark, it's so gritty, and really we have it to where Brandon has simple needs of eventually trying to see if he can quite possibly get a girlfriend, and when that doesn't work out, well, there is also a thing for that too. Yeah, there's a thing for that too. We end up having Brandon kind of getting the further along that we go on into this movie, the more he kind of secludes himself from all of the rest of beings in life and whatever. And really, we end up having him kind of realizing that he may be a better. And so that becomes really interesting. We also have a moment within this movie that is kind of very reminiscent of Smallville, where we end up seeing Clark Kent going and taking a tractor and not realizing how really and truly strong he is. And he ends up accidentally flinging the tractor seemingly miles and miles away. So that was kind of a very interesting point to remember of that iconic scene in Smallville, and it's kind of recreated here with a slightly different like way of doing things. I really like that we end up having this character kind of slowly but surely trying to creep you out through this entire film. It's not something where he's going to be right in your face with his power, and I can really appreciate that, to where every single person is just being uncomfortable by Brandon, to the point to where Brandon is just going to step in, is like, you know what? Like, I could just you any second and I wouldn't have a second thought about it. We end up having Brandon, who is to eventually hear words, hear things coming from his barn. And so we end up having Brandon, who is consistently being manipulated through a voice within his barn. And so we end up kind of wondering if Brandon could have avoided all this if he wasn't so seemingly manipulated by the voices coming from his barn, who may or may not have been other people of Brandon's planet, or it could be any number of things. We'll just have to go through and talk about that in spoiler terms. I would say that there is some moments of this movie that are really just like I cannot watch again. There's some moments where it's just like I cannot watch this. It is really too gross. Like the whole, like, we end up having a scene where a woman is pulling glass from out of her eye, and that is gotta be the most horrific scene in this entire film. So I'm kind of gearing people up for that if you have not seen this movie before. So go into this realizing how gory that this movie could be at some point in time. We also have some other kind of gory moments, but I'll like here and there. But eventually I will get to that in spoilers, because this movie is not for the faint of heart. Why do we have to still say that kind of saying? People should realize how much of a rating is in a movie. Like, they should not go into this superhero film thinking like, oh yeah, like I can bring my kids into this film. No. Cause yeah, like you have a woman at some part of this movie that is full on displayed from neck down, and she has a opening within her chest that is down in some portion of this home via this barn, and so on and so forth. So really, yeah, like there is some very dark and disturbing moments in this movie. We end up having it where we end up finding out how really and truly creepy Brandon eventually gets into this film. But that is also the thing that I just like about it. I like the fact that we end up having this kid who seems to be the nicest kid in the world and seems so innocent and whatever, and then we end up seeing this Brightburn version of him, or what I would call the the knitted the knitted sheet of which that he puts his face upon. Uh, Man, do I actually just really enjoy this costume. It's very simple, and really we have it to mostly be just a guy wearing a almost scarecrowish like mask and a cape. Simple, but yet so interesting and so visually different than anything that we have consistently seen. I like how simple this movie is. I like how just really interesting it goes about doing the whole Superman angle, and I just enjoy this movie, and not everybody will. So let's get into spoilers about this film. I kind of just gushed about this movie for just 10 minutes and just kind of talked about things a little bit here and there. So let's dare say go into this and say spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we end up having, like, I think I'm going to try and do this like in which the ways of which that would make sense to do this movie out to where like we won't have to like skirt back around to certain scenes and so on and so forth. So we have Tori and Kyle who are in their bedroom who are trying to make a baby. It seems very difficult for them, of course, to make a child because script would say so. So we end up having these two making a baby, and we end up finding out that it seems that a ship had landed right around their barn. And so we end up having Tori and Kyle who are to go out to this barn. And so later on in the movie, we end up having Kyle who is having all these dreams, all these nightmares, all of these uh, things of probably real, true, legitimate memory going on within this film. So we end up having Kyle dreaming, and he's having all these hallucinations, and he's not quite sure what he's thinking, feeling, and whatever. And so we end up having Kyle dreaming that it seems that that the wall that was right in front of him had been taken out of his house. And so we end up having Kyle walk right up to Tori, who is holding a baby in her arms, and it seems that spaceship that they had found had crash landed into a tree of sorts, but the baby is fine and the ship is fine. So we are to understand now like what had happened to lead up to these people getting this child, even though it's not exactly the exact way everything goes within this film. We end up, I think, having it to where Tori was so desperate to have a child that she easily and quickly just adopted this kid and had no never mind about it. We end up having Kyle, who I'm not sure even really wanted this child, or I think when Kyle starts to realize how not exactly this being the kid he has always ever wanted, we end up having Kyle almost putting his own son down. Even when he goes out with him and his buddies, he ends up actually just saying, well, hey, maybe my son is just kind of crazy, or maybe my kid is just damaged, or maybe my kid is whatever, what have you. Like he's not really my blood. Like, dude, I could give him up at any minute because he's not really mine. So going on into here, we end up having a kid who ends up growing up to be Brandon. So we have Brandon who ends up going into shul, and he ends up going and is seemingly an artist of sorts. We end up having Brandon who is to go to school and basically tell us every little bit about some kind of bug of sorts, or some kind of uh, like kind of whole entire backstory of some insect or bug or whatever, and we end up having all the students just going like, dude, what a bookworm, what a know-it-all. And we end up having seemingly Caitlin, who ends up turning around uh, from her desk and saying like, well, hey man, like eventually the smart people will be eventually the guys who end up ruling this world. And so we end up having Brandon, who kind of takes a liking to Caitlin, to where eventually he wants to decide to maybe take him and her a friendship to quite possibly another level of sorts. But he may not know exactly what exactly that means because he's a young boy. So we end up having it to where eventually that that Tori and Kyle are to go and eventually kind of look through Brandon's room early on in this movie, and so they end up kind of seeing some kind of very odd like pictures of sorts. We end up having one girl in a bikini, but then we also start seeing uh, recently some like body parts and some pictures of some organs and stuff like that. And I'm assessing or assuming that Brandon has these pictures to honestly like remind him of the things that he can see while he has x-ray vision, because we're assuming or assessing that this character has every single power that Superman has. And a lot of people could get confused with that scene and just be like, okay, like this guy is just weird. No, I think that this guy has consistently been using x-ray vision to see through people, that really eventually like he wants to try to understand what he's actually seeing, and so he ends up taking a bunch of photos of stuff that he has already seen before and go in and try to like figure this all out. And so we end up having it to where Brandon ends up going to sleep at night. And so we end up early on in this sequence, we end up having Tori, who ends up doing a game of hide and seek with Brandon, and Tori ends up trying to whistle to see where Brandon is at, to where eventually Brandon is not found, to where eventually Brandon just jumps out at her and scares Tori, and because they're just playing. And so we end up having it to where I would have actually shot that scene differently. I would have actually had Brandon start hearing the voices in the barn via that scene. And then once we have the actual Brandon now sleeping in his room, seemingly tons and tons of miles away from this said barn, we end up having Brandon who is hearing these voices and he can't quite decipher what it all actually means. We end up having Brandon hearing like a take at some point and this and that, and he's just not quite understanding. And so we end up having Brandon trying to decipher or try to figure out the language of his people, so to speak, to where we eventually end up having Brandon, who ends up sneaking out of his home and supposedly sleepwalks to try and go and unlock this part of this barn of which that he cannot. And so we end up having Tori going and looking for Brandon in the middle of the night, and eventually she ends up going uh, and seeking him out via the barn and stops him from getting to his spaceship. And so we end up having Tori just kind of fluffing this off as just like, well, like, I don't know, maybe he was just like playing around, or maybe he was just sleepwalking. Maybe there's nothing really to it. And so Tori doesn't even tell this to Kyle, she just lets it go. And so we eventually consistently have Brian consistently going out to the barn and uh, just kind of doing things, or just kind of just standing around, to where eventually Kyle is to go and find him, and not really quite understanding exactly what Brandon is doing. And so Kyle grabs Brandon and tries to get him skirted back into the house. And then so Tori has to tell Kyle that it's like, well, yeah, like he's been sleepwalking bizarrely. I don't quite understand exactly what that means. So we eventually have it to where eventually Brandon is to start slowly and surely eventually trying to figure out what the whole language that he is seemingly continuing to get. And so eventually we end up having it to where Tori and Kyle end up finding Brandon's kind of photos. And so we end up having Kyle taking Brandon along with him for a trip somewhere, for a hunt somewhere. And so Kyle has to now give him like the birds and the bees kind of story. Kyle tells Brandon, it's like, well, hey man, like if you ever actually like feel that you can be like really and truly interested in a girl, like maybe you should actually act on it. Like, and maybe if you like ever feel like you also need to eventually like, like touch yourself, like go ahead and like do that too. And Brandon's like, right here? And Kyle's like, well, no, not like right here and now. Like we end up having it to where like Brandon like isn't exactly quite understanding what Kyle is saying, and Kyle isn't breaking it down in the best of ways either, to where a lot of what Kyle ends up saying is a lot of just like very cryptic like stuff, where you honestly and really truly don't exactly understand how Brandon could decipher what all his father had said. So we end up having it to where Brandon decides, is like, well, I'm really interested in Caitlin, so I think that I should go and try to romantically win her over. But Brandon doesn't exactly go about this in the best way. So Brandon ends up just kind of uh, being near Caitlin's window. And so Brandon, I guess, ends up speed running into Caitlin's room and turning on her radio and speeding out of her room. Caitlin ends up waking up, hearing the radio, and she ends up turning it off, turning around to just be kind of confused how her radio had gotten turned on, and then she instantly sees that Brandon is actually at her window. She gets frightened, and so she ends up calling her mother in to help cope with the fact that there was Brandon in her home for a split second. We end up having Caitlin, who after that moment had been very creeped out by Brandon, and so we end up having it to where Caitlin is very uncomfortable around Brandon, to the point to where they are all together within a PE class, and they are doing some trust fall exercises, to where everybody's to get around in a circle, and one person is supposed to be kind of falling over consistently, and people are eventually supposed to push him off to the side and push him around, so that way eventually uh, he can feel like the entire class could be trusted along with him. But we end up having Caitlin, who is consistently being uh, a person that has Brandon being shoved into her consistently. And so Caitlin eventually just backs out of the way to where eventually Brandon ends up falling over. He ends up like smacking his head against this like concrete like thing. And so Brandon, of course, did not, of course, get hurt because he really just basically can't. But to get even to Caitlyn for the fact that Caitlyn had kind of called Brandon a perv and that she basically told him that she hated him and all kinds of things, making him look bad amongst his whole entire classmates. We end up having Brandon grabbing Caitlyn's arm, and he just ends up deciding to just twist it and break it. Which I cannot justify that action, but I can understand that, like, Brandon kind of misconstrued the whole situation. That. I'm going to pause here for a second. He misconstrued the whole situation because he was getting advice from his father that didn't seem all good and right, and Brandon thought that he could be romantic, but instead he ended up being weird. But then eventually Caitlyn kind of also really kind of treated Brandon horribly just because she was scared by him. And you can't actually confirm that it was him because Caitlyn only saw him for mere seconds. Like, could she have guaranteed that this was Brandon? How could she confirm that Brandon was in her home and did all of these things? How could she exactly, with Brandon's speed and Brandon's whichever, how could she have confirmed that this was Brandon whatsoever? Like, maybe she made a mistake. But we end up having Caitlyn double down on that mistake by having her shout out that Brandon is a perv, and that like basically like he is going to be an outcast for probably the rest of his life when he's going to be in school. And so because of this shouting of this word simply, so we end up now having really just Brandon in really hot water because we end up having the sheriff who is like, dude, you broke a girl's arm. Like, if anything, you could go to like a juvie for this or jail or whichever for this. And so we end up having now Brandon, who had gone at some point at night to get every little bit of code that is coming from his planet, his homeworld, his people, to basically say take over the world. And so, pause here for a second. So now that we have Brandon, who is to be connected with his home planet heritage, we end up having Brandon who realizes that, well, dude, I can be disconnected from every single person. What do I need? What do I need to conform to school, or why do I need to do whatever their rules want me to do, when in all actuality, like, I am now stronger, I am faster, I am just there better. We eventually have at some point where we see Brandon testing this strength by having himself go and try and start a lawnmower consistently. And eventually we end up having Brandon who accidentally takes this lawnmower and flings it hundreds of feet into the air. And so we end up having Brandon going back to retrieve this lawnmower to realize that the lawnmower blade is still spinning and this lawnmower is upside down. And we end up having Brandon who takes his hand into the blade to have this lawnmower stop. And Brandon is starting to figure out his power. He's starting to figure out how strong he actually and really and truly is. So, and eventually, once he ends up getting the real true knowledge of his homeworld, we end up having Brandon just feeling that he is absolutely unstoppable at this point. So, very rarely do we actually see Brandon actually use his laser beam like powers. It's a very rare thing, or really, we don't actually have Brandon actually using this power, having it pop out of his eyes for a bulk of this movie, but we consistently have Brandon who has his eyes turn bright red to be very intimidating. So, we end up having it to where Brandon is to forcibly see a counselor that is actually part of his family. It seems that Brandon has an uncle named Noah, and Noah's wife is actually Marilee. Or Marilee? Yeah. Whatever. That's all. So, Marilee ends up being the counselor of Brandon, and so we end up having Marilee, who is just kind of conflicted because she's like, well, I'm kind of the only counselor here, and like I have to basically interview you and kind of see if you're very remorseful about what you had done to Caitlin, like to really try to dissect you and try to figure you out if you're really like sorry about what you've done, so that way the sheriff doesn't come in here and want to arrest you, because technically the kid could have been. And so we end up having Brandon who is to talk to Marilee, and it just kind of seems like he doesn't really care at this point. Like, really, we have it to where Brandon is talking to Marilee about, like, well, you know what, I just feel that I'm just kind of better than everybody, and so reasonably, like, I don't really care about consequences. I don't really care about what actions I do or do not take, because it does not matter. Because reasonably, whatever happens, happens. Like, I can get out of it, I can do whatever I want. And so we end up having Marilee going like, well, you know what, like, this doesn't really sound like anything of guilt, this doesn't sound like remorse, this doesn't sound like anything. And so we have it to where Marilee is just kind of like, you know what, like, this kid should actually go and, like, see somebody. We end up having both Kyle and Tori, who are really consistently, once they consistently keep dealing with Brandon and his problems, we end up having eventually Tori and Kyle kind of like asking one another, like, should Brandon actually see somebody? Should Brandon actually like find a specialist? And we end up having eventually where Kyle is like, what kind of specialist would there be for this? Like, this kid came from another planet. Like, how exactly are we going to be able to get this kid to the right person? And like, this is Brightburn, this is not like Washington DC, this is not New York, this is not LA, this is not whatever. Like, we would have to find the right person and in any part of this world, and it would be severely difficult, if anything, because people wouldn't even justify, like, no, this whole family is crazy, this kid isn't really an alien, no matter what they kind of say. So anyways, we end up having it to where Brandon ends up going and seeing Caitlin yet again. And so we end up having Brandon kind of confessing that he really does like Caitlin, and and Caitlin is just kind of terrified about Brandon, and Caitlin ends up saying, "Well, my mother will never allow us to be a couple or be together or whatever," and so Brandon's like, "Oh, okay, well, I can take care of that." Horrifyingly, so we end up having Brandon, who seems to be having a very active life. But then eventually we also have Brandon, who also has these backstories to try to confirm what the heck all that he had done with his day or whatever. I'm sure a lot of times he probably did like ditch school and all kinds of other things to uh, try to get to the people that he needed to or whatever, what have you. So we end up having Brandon going and finding seemingly Caitlin's mother. It seems that Caitlin's mother works at some like diner, some fast food joints, some whichever, and so we end up having it uh, to where Brandon is to go and write his two double B's, his signal or his symbol all over this woman's restaurant's windows. And so we also have it to where Brandon goes in and seemingly has one of these windows break to have it to where Caitlin's mother gets hit with this glass, and so then she actually has to pull a thing of glass from out of her eye. So we end up having Caitlin's mother, who is to eventually kind of get spooked by Brandon consistently, to where she ends up deciding to run into the freezer because she thinks that's the safest place for her. Well, surefire enough, we end up having now Brandon, who uses his laser beam like powers to burn his way uh, through this freezer to get to Caitlin's mother and to eventually just kill her. To where eventually we end up seeing her body displayed later in the barn somewhere, just kind of dissected and whatever what have you. So we end up having it to where eventually the sheriff is to show up at this restaurant, and we end up having also nobody's none the wiser of Brandon, but it seems that he keeps sketching this logo, this design in his notebook. Eventually, more and more people start to see Brandon's notebook and start to see these designs being drawn, even his mother, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where the sheriff is to go and just kind of investigate this whole murder and or this missing person, really, because they haven't found the body. And it seems that something has been broke into in this establishment. It seems that Caitlin's mother is now gone, and so on and so forth. So we end up having the sheriff blowing on the glass of this restaurant to see this signal, this logo, because he's not quite sure exactly what that is. So we end up having it to where the sheriff kind of sketches this logo to have it in the back of his mind to eventually just use this to find this later. So now we end up having it to where I guess Brandon is just like he could probably care less about Caitlin, even though he ended up kind of murdering her mother and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where I'm assuming Caitlin kind of probably went into like witness protection or some other thing. But anyways, so and plus like there's kind of evidence there that Brandon had gone and done something with Caitlin's mother. We're very unsure about that because Caitlin ended up talking to Brandon, and there's kind of motive there. So we eventually end up having it to where Mara Lee is talking to Brandon, and eventually she's saying, well, you know what? Like, I think I'm just going to have to talk to the sheriff tomorrow, and we're just going to have to just figure something out. And so we end up having Brandon going out of his way to find Mara Lee's home and tell her, it's like, well, you know what? I just don't think that you should go and talk to the sheriff. I just think that that'll be a bad thing for you. And Mara Lee is like, you know what? You're kind of making me really uncomfortable. And you know what? How about you get out of here? How about you leave? And so instead, we have Mara Lee, who her alarm system is consistently going haywire because of Brandon, because his super speed is making her alarm consistently going off. To where when Mara Lee is to try and adjust this security thing, we end up having Brandon, who is already in the home. So we end up having Kyle, who is having drinks with his friends and his friend Noah, and so we end up having Noah, who is talking to Kyle, and to mention how, like, I guess that Mara Lee had spilled to Noah about how weird that Brandon is, and Kyle is like, well, hey, maybe he is crazy, maybe he is weird, maybe he is a freak. I don't know anymore. And here's a scene. We also have it to where Brandon is to have a birthday party where he is to have Noah give him a gun of sorts, and we end up having Kyle saying, like, well, no, I don't think he's quite old enough for a gun yet. Like, I think this just isn't the right time. And we end up having Brandon telling Kyle, it's like, well, no, give me the gun. And Kyle was like, no, like, you're not ready for it yet. And then Brandon's like, give it to me. And then they end up kind of just like stopping the whole party. They end up just grabbing Brandon and just walking him out of that restaurant and just calling it a night, because it's just like, dude, he's just getting argumentative, and like, we need to go. We end up having Kyle also mentioning about the one good thing that he ever did as a father, which was to basically just shove candy into Brandon's face. And that's the only one thing that he ever did good as a father, evidently, in this movie. And I'm like, wait a minute, so we could really showcase this, that Kyle does not care at all about this son, and really his proudest moment is the one moment where he just shoved candy in front of his son to shut him up, kind of thing. To where, like, that was his proudest moment of him not being able to know at all about what to do with parenting, but luckily he just had a candy in front of him that he could give Brandon to just kind of suffice for him to say that he did something fatherly, which wasn't actually anything worthwhile to mention. But I guess it's just looking back at, like, well, thank God that I had this one thing at my disposal to feel like I was a father once, that felt like I did something good. Because I'm assuming that probably Tori did most of the parenting, because it seems that she is just a painter and she's always home. To where really Kyle is, of course, doing his barn-like thing. And so they're probably kind of just both like almost home parents most of the time. So anyways, a lot of this could be kind of construed, or a lot of it could just be like to me, like, I think I'm doing it from and reviewing it from my perspective or my point of view, and others might feel differently. So we end up having now Kyle, who had mentioned maybe his son is crazy, maybe his son is a loon, and so we end up having these people all go home for the night all drunk, And so Noah ends up coming home and starting to just kind of go about his nightly duties or whatever, just kind of putting his clothes away and all kinds of things. And so we end up having Brandon, who is just kind of sneaking around in Noah's house. We end up having Noah, who is brushing his teeth, and Brandon is just kind of like latching himself onto one part of Noah's wall. And we end up having Brandon, who is consistently like doing these superpower like things to kind of skirt around Noah. And eventually we end up having just Brandon, who just ends up showing up in Noah's closet. And because we end up having Brandon, who's just like, okay, like, me playing with my food is just kind of getting boring. Like, could we, like, I think we should just resolve this. So we end up having Noah, who ends up finding Brandon. And so Noah is like, dude, why are you wearing some creepy mask? And why are you in my closet? And so Brandon is like, well, like, I was just talking to Mara Lee, and I just made my way in here. And so we end up having Noah, who ends up grabbing Brandon and is going to drive him back home to his place. And so we end up having Noah like mentioning that he's like, dude, I'm gonna mention this to your parents. Like, this is weird. Like, you should not have done this. And we end up having Brandon, who's like, well, how about you just not tell my parents? And Noah's like, huh? Like, what do you mean? Like, no, I'm going to tell your parents. And Brandon's like, no, you're not. And so we end up having Brandon, who ends up vanishing, and then Noah is like, what the heck? Like, where is this kid? And so we end up having Brandon, who I believe uses his laser vision onto Noah to bash him into his own garage, to where we end up having Brandon, who's just like, okay, this is a fun game. And so we end up having Brandon, who is scared, and he ends up not seeing Noah is scared, and so Brandon is like kind of luring around Noah, and so Noah is just like, dude, I just got to get out of here. So we end up having Brandon run into his car and try to drive as much as humanly possible to get wherever he needs to go. And so we eventually at some point having Brandon just kind of like flying around Noah, and Noah is freaking out. To where eventually we have it to where eventually Noah is to have car trouble. And so Brandon is just kind of floating in midair, to where Noah is like, oh my God, like, come on, car, come on. And so we inevitably have it to where Brandon is like, okay, like, I'm done with this. So we end up having Brandon, who ends up lifting Noah's car and basically flipping it over. And we end up having Noah, who ends up bashing his face on this on the steering wheel of his car, and he ends up completely like losing, like, his bottom half of his face is just kind of ill proportioned to his mouth. And so we end up having Noah, who is trying to cover up and try to stop his face from bleeding. And we end up having Noah, who's getting closer, or we end up having Brandon, who's getting closer and closer to Noah, and then trying to touch a thing of blood of Noah's, so that way he can draw the BB symbol and then leave. We end up having Noah, who ends up going to the hospital, and it seems that we have Mara Lee, who ends up telling both Kyle and Tori that it seems that that Noah is injured, and so we end up having Tori and Kyle scramble to the hospital, and it seems that Kyle is kind of convinced that Brandon had been a part of this somehow. Because we end up having Tori and Kyle waiting for Brandon, and so we end up having Brandon coming home mentioning that he had played some football with some kids, and he ended up tearing his shirt, and so he kind of comes home shirtless. And so we end up having the parents saying like, well, what, hey, where, like, could I get your shirt? And Brandon's like, no, 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 don't, excuse me, don't do anything with it. Like, I'll just, like, I'll figure something out. And so we end up having, like, really, Brandon could have just thrown the shirt away, but he ended up saving it for story purposes. So we end up having Kyle saying, you know what, this is like a really weird story. It doesn't seem very convincing. We end up having Kyle and Tori talking about it, and it doesn't really seem like that seems like a legitimate story. And so we end up having it to where Kyle had supposedly upon him, or Kyle, Brandon upon himself had ended up deciding to walk home because of his slights and his problems with friends of his. So we end up having Noah and Tori going to the hospital, and Kyle is like, you know what? Like, where was Brandon when Caitlin's mother was, like, gone missing? Where was Brandon when Noah was injured? And so we end up having Tori and Kyle who end up talking to Meryl Lee, and she ends up saying that she ended up bumping into Brandon, and she hoped that he got home safe. And we end up having Kyle, who was just kind of like, yeah, that seems kind of weird. Like, when did Brandon get to Meryl Lee's place? So we eventually have it to where Kyle is very suspicious of his own son, and so we end up having Kyle, who is to him and Tori are to break the news to Brandon that his uncle, while at the hospital, had died. And so they end up breaking the news to Brandon, and Brandon just doesn't really quite care. He's just kind of like, well, like, yeah, it's really too bad that Uncle Noah had died, and I do love him, and so on and so forth. But we end up having it to where, like, Tori and, like, Kyle were thinking that Brandon was going to take this news horrifically, that he was going to cry about it, and all kinds of things. And Brandon just was like, meh, like, so he died. Okay, all right, so yeah. And so we end up having Kyle, who's taking Noah's death really hard, to the point of Brandon just being like, well, like, why aren't you crying right now? Why aren't you emotional about this? Why aren't you being much more of a human, you freak, and all kinds of things? And like, where were you last night when Noah was hurt? Where were you when Caitlin's mother was gone? Where were you exactly? Tell me now. And so we end up having just Kyle just grabbing onto his son to the point to where Brandon just has to shove Kyle into some piece of furniture or whatever, or some wall or something, and then Brandon just goes up and goes and takes a shower. And so we end up having Kyle seemingly just like, well, you know what, like, this was a mistake. Maybe I should just tell Tori that, you know what, like, maybe I should just take him out to a hunt and just kind of tell him that I love him, and just have this moment where I'm going to tell Tori that Brandon is really my son and I should really treat him that way. So we end up having Kyle, who is to also go into Brandon's room and try to find the shirt of which that he had hidden. And so we end up having Kyle, who ends up finding the shirt, ends up finding blood on it, and now has to be very suspicious about it, and to bring Tori this shirt to just say, oh yeah, this shirt has Noah's blood on it. And so we end up having Tori is like, well, you can't confirm that. You're not a CSI person. So we push along. So we end up eventually having it to where Kyle is to go on a hunt with his son And so we end up having it to where Kyle goes on this hunt with his son, and we have it to where Brandon and Kyle are just kind of very disconnected, and so we eventually get to the point to where eventually Kyle is to say within this hunt that he ends up hearing something, and so Brandon ends up getting out a little bit of ahead of Kyle, and then we have this moment where like, oh my God, Kyle is going to shoot his own son. Like, this is horrific. And so, because we end up having it to where Kyle could just brush this off as a mistake that reasonably Brandon was kind of goofing off or something like that. And so really Kyle could also say that Brandon isn't actually his son all along, that maybe he could say that he ended up finding out that his son was an alien and so on and so forth, and wash this all off as just being like, well, like, yeah, this kid was keeping me held hostage as being an alien, and I found it out and it was too late, so on and so forth. So the numerous stories that Kyle could have had. So we end up having Kyle, who is to go and shoot his own son, and the bullet just ends up bouncing off of Kyle's head. To where we end up having Brandon, who is to just go and start walking slowly up to his own father, to where Kyle is just like, well, wait a minute, like this is all a mistake. Like, let's think about this, Brandon. This is a mistake. And so we end up just having Brandon, who ends up taking his own father and lasering through Kyle's head to kill him, to basically say, well, you are going to shoot me through the head. Well, I will shoot you with the way of which that I can. So we end up having Tori, who is to eventually go through Brandon's room yet again to eventually, because she ended up having the sheriff come to her home to ask about some symbol that Tori knows that Brandon does, because Brandon had left that symbol at Noah's death. And so we end up having now Tori going through Brandon's notebook and seeing these symbols and seeing that that Brandon is also responsible for all of these deaths, because through this entire notebook we have Brandon kind of visually representing and showcasing all of these deaths that he has done. And so we end up having Tori calling Kyle to try to say like, oh my God, we figured out that our son was a murderer. And so we have Tori, who is to call Kyle to just like, dude, I figured it all out. Like, hello. Yeah, Dad can't come to the phone right now. He's a little blown up. He's gone. And Tori's like, what do you mean by gone? And Brandon's like, you know, gone. You know. So we end up having Tori, who is now just like, oh my God, like my son is going to come back to get me. And so we end up having Tori, who is like scrambling through her house, and we end up having in an instant that Brandon is there, and he is just flying through the house trying to scare his mother consistently. And we end up having Tori calling the police. We end up having the deputy make her way there, and we end up having Brandon easily taking her out, to the point of her just looking all very much bloody and carnagey and gross looking. Because we end up having, realistically, like Brandon just taking anybody, grabbing them, and just like flying them through whatever parts of these homes and so on and so forth, to just basically just kill them off easily enough. So we eventually have it to where Tori had seen Brandon talking to his biological spaceship earlier on, and we end up finding out that Brandon could get cut via this spaceship, and so Tori's like, "Oh my god, nothing in this Earth will take him down," but his spaceship ended up cutting him. So we end up having Tori scrambling to the barn, and so Brandon is also hiding within this barn, and so we end up having Tori who is scrambling to get a chunk of Brandon's spaceship, and then we end up having Tori who ends up doing the whistle and hide and seek game to try and have Brandon come out. So we end up having Tori who is now to who is now to yeah almost done here. We are having Brandon now going and meeting his mother, and we end up having Tori who is to like tell him that he will always be her baby boy, and every little bit of anything that she could say to have it be that Brandon won't quite just kill her yet. And so we end up having Tori who ends up putting a piece of Brandon's spaceship in her back pocket, and to where Tori is hugging on Brandon, and eventually she ends up getting the shard piece out slowly but surely. We end up having Brandon realizing what Tori is doing, and Brandon ends up taking the piece from Tori. And so we end up having it to where Brandon has realized that every single person that had supposedly loved him, it had at one point or another turned on him or treated him poorly. So we end up having Brandon just taking his mother and just flying her up with himself. So we end up having both Brandon and Tori just flying through this barn, to where eventually we end up seeing Tori just kind of just battered and whatever, to where eventually Brandon just keeps continuing to take her up higher and higher and higher, to way above the clouds, to almost like Earth's atmosphere, to where the air gets really, really thin. And so we eventually end up having Brandon, who after this moment is to then drop his mother and have her just go falling into the sky to eventually be killed off, of course. We end up having Brandon, who is to see a plane flying into the sky, and I guess we just have Brandon just naturally just go, well, like, I guess I'm just going to start annihilating people anyways. Might as well just justify that, really we could have this whole carnage situation and my parents' death not lead back to me, because this could all just be an accident of sorts. So we end up having Brandon, who ends up purposely crashing this plane onto his barn. And so the news reports were all mentioning about a barn that ended up crashing, or an airplane that ended up crashing into this barn, leaving so many dead. We end up having it to where we end up seeing on the news that there is some entity that is going on to destroy and annihilate so many parts and pieces of Brightburn, and so on and so forth. We end up having a news reporter that, of course, looks like Michael Rooker, going on here to mention that there are numerous other monstrous-looking people that are to be going on and hurting the earth. We end up having Michael Rooker mention that there seemingly is a girl that ends up trying to choke and or murder people with ropes, which kind of reminds us of Wonder Woman. And there was also some creature that ended up coming out of the water, which we are to assume that maybe that is Aquaman or something along those lines. And so Michael Rooker starts mentioning all these monsters and so on and so forth that is to be villainish people. And yeah, so really that is to all just end the movie. And I just thought that this movie was really just fascinating. I would have really just honestly just enjoyed probably even a sequel to this movie, but I don't think that is ever going to happen. I assume naturally this is just going to be a one-off film that is never going to have a sequel to it, or there's never going to be like all of a sudden like a evil Justice League kind of style of movie, which I actually think would be kind of cool to see. But anyways, with that said, I am going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.